Good morning from Washington. This is Matthew Goodman at CSIS. I apologize you can't see me. Maybe you can see a headshot of me in my youth. But appreciate your joining us for this live online webinar on Allied cooperation on China. We have a terrific program that we're going to try and compress into an efficient 75 minutes or so. Welcome to viewers around the world. We know there are people in the United States and Europe and Asia and probably other places listening in. I appreciate your joining us at a probably odd time of day. We're going to be talking about concerns here in Washington and in allied capitals about several aspects of China's economic rise and the implications of that in several areas. We've been tracking on the economic side, trade, technology, finance, other developments related to China, and this event is a culmination of some work we've been doing over the last couple of years in this on this topic, and we have a terrific program, which will start with a 30-minute keynote presentation, which I'll introduce the speaker in just a second. Then we'll have a 45-minute panel discussion with experts from Canada, the European Union, and Japan. We are recording this session. It is on the record. You'll be able to submit questions through the Zoom chat function. We'll try to take your questions in both segments of this webinar, but apologies if we can't get to all of them. I want to thank the members of the Allied Economic Forum, which is a group of 10 countries we convene to discuss multilateral economic policy issues, for their generous support for this event. So with that, I'm delighted to announce our keynote speaker today, Baroness Helena Kennedy QC. Baroness Kennedy is a Scottish barrister, broadcaster, Labour member of the House of Lords. She's one of Britain's most distinguished lawyers and is a prominent human rights campaigner on issues from women's rights to the erosion of political freedoms in Hong Kong, which is obviously a very topical issue today. She has too many titles and responsibilities to go through. It'll take all morning to do that, but she importantly is director of the International Bar Association's Institute of Human Rights, and she is co-chair of the newly formed Inter-Parliamentary Alliance on China, which is a very interesting development that I think she'll talk about, and I'll ask her about if she doesn't, because it's a very interesting development formed in June to help legislators around the world craft a coordinated and strategic approach on issues related to China. So one other thing, just a personal note, which is that we have another connection, Lady Kennedy and I. She was chair of the United World College of the Atlantic Board, an international high school, which I attended eons ago in Wales, and I'm delighted to have that connection. She's done great work for that school, and I really appreciate that at a personal level. So with that, Lady Kennedy, we look forward to your remarks, 15 minutes or so, and then my colleague Stephanie Siegel may end up moderating the discussion because she can see the audience questions and I cannot. So please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Matthew. Thank you very much. And it's a great pleasure to be joining you today. It's early morning for many of you, but it's early afternoon here in the UK. I wanted to start by saying that the rise of China has presented liberal democracies, I think, with a new challenge. And I think we've been rather slow to engage with it. I mean, the question is, how do you cooperate with a nation which is undoubtedly now a superpower with great economic power in the world and great technological abilities, and yet at the same time doesn't share our values around the rule of law and human rights and the protections that we consider fundamental in a democracy, like a free media and so on. And that engagement involves, I think, a revisiting of some of our policies. And for us in Britain, we've at different times had sort of policy initiatives. And I'm not sure that they feed across well enough. But the last real sort of policy initiative was under the Prime Minister Cameron, David Cameron, and George Osborne, his Chancellor, which was about the golden era, that we were going to enter into a great period of working alongside China and trading comfortably and engaging in a very wholehearted way. Unfortunately, that sort of hasn't quite come to be, and we've watched a number of things take place. There's been a resistance on the Conservative benches amongst those who are now have got much more powerful voice in our political system. There has been a real move to the right on the Conservative Party, and there are many of them who feel very strongly about national security. They've been very hostile to Huawei being involved with us, and you will have seen this morning that in your press, I'm sure they've covered the fact that Britain has pulled out of its engagement with Huawei, the great telecoms company. And so that is a real volte-face for the British government, and the minister who was making the announcement about it in Parliament yesterday took great pains not to say that it was in any way related to events in Hong Kong or in relation to our concerns about human rights abuses, the matters which have brought me into an engagement on China, but really was very much about the fact that sanctions that the United States provides a chip which is fundamental to the workings of the highway hubs in this country, and therefore without that cooperation from the United States and the supply of those essential components, we would our security system would be put at risk, because we would have to look elsewhere for those chips, and therefore there were security issues which changed the view of our intelligence agencies as to the security questions, which previously they'd felt were not of any great consequence. So there's been this great change around. Of course, the position is that China has been saying and responded very quickly by saying that Britain was the poodle of the United States, and that's something that's been said about us before, and that we're really jumping to Donald Trump's demands over disentangling ourselves from Huawei. I certainly think that's very high, obviously very high on the president's agenda. But for us in Britain, there is no doubt that this is to some extent linked with the strong feeling that there is in Parliament about what has happened in Hong Kong. You know, Britain was involved with Hong Kong, you know, for so long. In the end of our period of engagement there and the handover, it was a very, very difficult negotiation, and the agreement that was reached was that it would be, you know, one nation, two systems, and that certainly for the next 50 years it was going to be absolutely entrenched. And what we've seen is an encroachment on that, and a level of distrust now of China and China's intentions with regard to Hong Kong, especially with the new legislation on security, and what that means to the people in Hong Kong, to the judiciary. It's a real attack on the rule of law, because if any of you have followed that closely, you'll know that this new security legislation means that any sense in which people are campaigning around independence or greater sovereignty for Hong Kong, any of those sorts of actions will lead to potential prosecutions, and that they would be tried not before the general judiciary in Hong Kong, but a hand-picked judiciary, and or possibly even tried in China itself. And certainly as to sentencing, that it would be falling under the authorities in China. Also, that there have been utterances in recent times about the fact that the highest court in Hong Kong is not the last court of recourse, but that actually China has the final say on matters of legality and law. So all these things have set up huge alarm bells for us. We've watched what's been taking place on the business of extradition, the ways in which a British consul was picked up in China, in Hong Kong, and then taken to China, was tortured and imprisoned. We've watched, and I certainly, as a lawyer in Britain who has sort of had long connections with the lawyers in Hong Kong, and have watched their involvement in the creation of a basic law, which is like a Bill of Rights. Their concerns are ones that I identify with very strongly, and I've followed and been at the receiving end of many pieces of notification, sort of intelligence about abuses of activists in China. And of course, the whole business of what has happened to the Uyghur has been very much at the forefront of my work. I now, as well as being a practitioner in law and a parliamentarian, I also am the director of the International Bar Association's Institute of Human Rights. So these things come through to us, and there was, of course, the China papers, which really did disclose the extent to which the Uyghur people are being persecuted in Jiangxing province. So those things ended up really pressing upon many parliamentarians on the Labour benches as well as on the Conservative benches, the Liberal benches, and in the House of Lords, many of the crossbench peers who are non-aligned have been speaking out about the sort of ways in which there has been a shift, a change in China's engagement with the outside. And if you'd asked me 10 years ago, I thought we were on a track where China, in its desire to be part of, globalization, the global market, and to play in it, and so on, I wouldn't have imagined that we would have seen this particular trajectory that we're now seem to be on. I want to make it very clear that when the IPAC was created, which is this Inter-Parliamentary Coalition on China, when that was brought into being, it was only just over a month ago, it was really about wanting there to be a multilateral approach to events that were taking place in and around China. And it brought together people of very different political complexion. If you were to know anything about me, I come from the left, centre-left position politically. Whereas Ian Duncan Smith, who was the formerly, a leader of the Conservative Party, is very much to the right of even of his own party. His position and mine might be somewhat different on certain elements, but where we come together is in agreeing that we should be working multilaterally around the issue of engagement with China. We also in Britain should have a much clearer policy position with regard to our relationships with China. And for me, of course, it's that if we're going to trade with China, I think that there has to be a high level of trust. And there has to be a sharing of certain, if there has to be a level of conditionality. And for me, we don't talk loudly enough about transgressions on the human rights and rule of law front. And I just think we should have better conversations about all of that. I'm not a hawk, and I do not think that the way to talk about this is in the Cold War language that is currently, I'm afraid, emanating from your own White House, and indeed from certain sections of British political life. But I do think that we have to think better about what has been happening in recent times. And I do also think that the Belt and Road policy of President Xi, it creates an indebtedness in whole stretches, certainly of Africa, where there really are concerns about what the implications of that are. And I think that we should be visiting some of that change, and it is a change that's happened over more recent years, and examine what it will mean in the world as we go forward. I want to say, and it might not fall on, I don't know the complexion of our audience, but I think it's not helpful for us to develop a new Cold War and for it to be with China. I really feel that is not the road to go down, and we just have to find ways of getting around tables and seeing how better relationships can be developed. But I do think that having trade wars is not the way forward either. But I do come at this as a lawyer involved with human rights issues, involved with those who are advocating for human rights protections in Hong Kong. And I'm very concerned about the persecution of the Uyghur, but also the ways in which technology has been used by the Chinese authorities to really invade the lives of their own people. And we should be alert to the fact that that will have implications for us too. So that was my opening remarks, and I know that there will be questions that...
Okay, thank you so much, Lady Kennedy, and I have appeared magically through the magic of Zoom. I hope you can see me now.
Matthew, it's lovely to see you.
Wonderful, lovely to see you. Thank you so much. Sorry about that technical glitch earlier on. So fascinating and really interesting the way you, framed the specific concerns you have, but then sort of the fact that this isn't about a Cold War or sort of a more generally hawkish position. There are just some specific concerns about human rights, about Belt and Road, and I think that's a very intelligent way to sort of look at this set of issues. Let me ask you, sort of broadly about how there are opportunities for countries that are concerned about these issues to come together. The IPAC is one way, and I'm going to come back to that, but just at a sort of governmental level, do you think, I mean, yesterday the United States also imposed some sanctions related to Hong Kong. It doesn't feel, though, like the G7, for example, the countries of the US, UK, the other advanced countries, each of whom has done some things, have really come together and had a conversation about this to try to develop a common approach. Britain's going to be hosting the G7 next year, and I wonder whether there might be an opportunity in a context like that for this group of countries to get together and say forcefully and consistently over time that some of the things that are happening in Hong Kong and you mentioned in Xinjiang and other concerns, that these are really shared concerns. That feels very powerful if we can do that. Do you think there's an opportunity for that?
Well, that was certainly one of the things that was discussed when we first started thinking about creating an international alliance of parliamentarians. Because it did start in the UK, and it started with this rather, people remark on it, this rather strange sort of coalition of Ian Duncan Smith and myself. But Ian too has been very concerned about human rights abuses, and there was no doubt that some of the energy for this came out of concerns by people here about what was happening in Hong Kong, what was happening generally towards Muslims in China, and we felt that it was the absence. I mean, I have to honestly say this: the absence of the traditional role that the United States has played in the world, and the isolationism that the United States has now taken as it stands has not helped in this. And so we then reached out to parliamentarians in other jurisdictions and in the United States, and so that we have a Democrat and a Republican as part of this coalition. We spoke early on to Canada, and then to different European. We've got the Germans are on board, and we've got the Belgians and the Dutch, and then we got Australia came on, of course, too, and the Japanese are now involved, and so we've really been building up this parliamentary coalition. But the purpose of it is, rather than it being just a talking shop, is that we actually do see this as working towards more effective debate and premises being presented to those G20 and G7 meetings that are going to be taking place over the next period. And that we really do want there to be a more effective kind of discussion about how you trade and what are the ground rules. And the sense is that you know, the ground rules don't seem to matter to China, and it has to be made clear that that it's not about, you know, exclusion, but it is about saying there are ground rules, and you have to be shown to be you know, abiding by them. And one of the things that you see that really has made, I think, British parliamentarians very concerned is that the Hong Kong thing actually is symbolic. And although the great effort was made yesterday when Oliver Dowden, who's the minister who made the announcement about Huawei, he made a great point of not mentioning Hong Kong at all. And it was all about the fact that if the United States is not going to be providing us with some of the components here, then we would have to go, you know, into the wider market, and then security issues would arise. It was felt, and so that particular part of the thing was seen as being vital, and therefore our security intelligence agencies had taken a different position, and therefore we were going to step away from our contractual relations with Huawei. But actually, to have had the breach of trust that is involved in the Hong Kong business has really made people feel very anxious about the business of trust in trading. Now, I mean, look at Australia. Australia's in a particularly tricky position because a third of Australia's exports go to China. And so they could suffer very greatly from a sort of breakdown in relations there. But of course, as soon as they said they wanted to have an investigation into the COVID-19 and its origins, China, you know, there was the cyber attack that, you know, I don't think the Australians have very much doubt where it emanated from. And so there are issues there about, could you close down the internet if Huawei was involved very deeply in our 5G system? And I mean, it does have downside for Britain because some of our rural areas, you know, they can't, you know, in the lockdown period, they couldn't get Netflix because we don't have a very good system yet in some parts of our, particularly our remoter regions. And so there were questions around, you know, but supposing we did find we were in tensions with China, could they bring pressure to bear on this company, which claims to be independent? Now, you know, just last night, I listened to Nathan Law. Nathan Law is one of the young protesters who actually has got out of China because he feels that he was definitely within the sights of the Chinese authorities, and he felt that he was likely to be arrested and incarcerated. So he's out, and he's now here in Britain, and he did an interview last night, and he was asked, you know, what about this decision on Huawei? And he said, no company in China, and he said, and everybody in Hong Kong knows this, no company in China can ever say that it is totally independent of pressure from the Chinese authorities. And we all know that. And so I think that, you know, it's that nagging thing at the back of trading relationships that I think worries people, but particularly when it comes to telecoms. So, what we mustn't see is this suddenly, you know, the skids going under this and it developing into something truly tragic. We've got to make sure that that we don't allow that to happen, and that there isn't an escalation of rhetoric. But I do think we have to have better conversations with China as we go forward.
And I agree with that. I think I'm just sort of trying to digest. We're getting some good questions coming in, and I was going to ask a question which I think picks up on the spirit of several of these questions that are coming in about the ability really to compartmentalize these issues as you've suggested. Because especially from Beijing's point of view, they're very sensitive about some of these issues that we're concerned about in Hong Kong and Xinjiang and so forth. They may not see, the ability to sort of compartmentalize this into a different category from our economic relationship or others. I mean, do you think there's a risk that, other interests are going to be harmed by this? And, particularly just to take the issue of Hong Kong, you've got a lot of companies there, so do we, a lot of individuals, I mean, hundreds of thousands, I think, in each of our cases living in Hong Kong. Are there risks to those people, those interests from, some of the stances we're taking, which again seems to be.
I would say that there of course are risks, and I think that that's why the language that was being used by the minister yesterday was very, very cautious and was trying to make those separations. I agree with you that I'm not sure that Hong Kong, that the Chinese authorities or President Xi is going to think that Hong Kong is not one of those things lurking in the background. I'm sure he knows that. I mean, indeed, your own president has made it very clear by making the statement around this only yesterday and greeting the decision by the British government on Huawei. So, and of course, we know that pressure has been put on Europe and other European countries in their use of the technology that Huawei has developed, which is, ahead of the game. So, I mean, there are questions. Sweden is highly involved with Huawei. Ireland is too. And I'm sure that there will be, pressures being brought to bear on them. So, I mean, to go back to your question about Hong Kong, there are risks for Hong Kong here, and financial risks and economic risks, undoubtedly. And that's why I do think that we have to try to not let this not turn up the heat too high on this. We've got to, on the one hand, make it very clear that we're talking about having ground rules, and we want to see movement on that. And if the Chinese, also want to turn down the heat on this, there has to be quite clear moves on the rule of law and on human rights. I at one stage, because I was visiting China and was involved, I chaired a thing called the British Council, which was the part of our diplomatic arm around the world. And China did seem to be moving at one point, but I'm afraid that President Xi is rather like so many of our current leaders in the world, very much a nationalist and very much a Han nationalist. And that is reflected in the policies that are dominating in China at the moment.
Yeah, well, I'm conscious of your time, and I don't want to abuse that, but one final, just very operational question about IPAC, the new Parliamentary Alliance. Is this something that's going to be meeting regularly? Are there going to be task forces? Are there going to be outputs from the work? Is it just a conversation which then, individual country representatives may feed into legislative debate or even legislation, or what's the sort of plan for this organization?
Well, I think that we're taking it a step at a time, but it is interesting that for example, people who are doing certain kinds of research in areas of China are, presenting papers to us, and we have opportunities of meeting to discuss them. The evidence that came through about sterilization and interference with the reproductive freedoms of women in Xinjiang and of Uyghur background came to us first before they were put into the public domain. And so we are looking at whether are areas of work that we should be, where we should be supporting very good research for us. But we haven't started on task forces or anything yet. I think we want to build up our numbers in other countries and to create a sort of, if you like, a broader coalition, and also to draw in perhaps people from, you know, at the moment it's the obvious places, and it would be rather good to have some of the nations that are more vulnerable to the vagaries of you know, the great powers. And so I think that we have to find ways in which we can engage in a better way with some of the African countries and some of the places that are already feeling somewhat beleaguered by virtue of their indebtedness, especially in this time where they've got the problems that are going to arise because of COVID-19 and the effect of that on economies everywhere. I mean, we are going to face a serious global recession in the next period, I think. And so there's going to be good reason for why we might want to be collaborative. And we haven't been good at that in recent times.
Yes, quite important. And actually, there have been questions about that question of whether you're going to try and reach out to a broader group of countries and parliamentarians. And that was, I think, something that others are interested in. So we'll be watching that with keen interest. I thank you so much for your time and your insights. We've had you at CSIS before. We'd love to have you back, especially when that's physically possible. Where you're always welcome here. And we will be in, well, at CSIS generally and in the economics program specifically, we're going to be tracking these issues, including the ones you've talked about in IPAC, and we hope we can keep in touch as we do that. But thank you so much.
I have no doubt that we'll learn from you. And I've often read your work, and I hope you'll keep me posted. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lady Kennedy. Really appreciate your time. So we'll sign off here, and then we're going to move right into the panel discussion. And I think I'm handing over directly to my colleague, Stephanie Siegel, Senior Fellow here in the Economics Program at CSIS. So Stephanie, if you're ready to go, I'll hand to you.
Excellent. Great. Well, thanks for that. And there was a lot there in Lady Kennedy's comments that we can pick up on with our panel. So we've got about 40 minutes to cover a lot of ground. Let me just, by way of introduction, note that the Center has been working on this issue of allied cooperation, and specifically this intersection of economic activities and national security concerns over the last 2.5 years or so under a grouping called the Allied Economic Forum. We're about to come out with a lessons learned paper in the next 2 weeks or so, but if I could just preview some of the top line lessons learned and then turn over to our excellent panelists to get their thoughts on some of these issues. But just the key top line lessons are in some respects obvious, but I don't think maybe they were quite so obvious just a few years ago. The first lesson is that the interconnectedness, not just of the global economy, but of research ecosystems, means that unilateral action is likely to be ineffective. We need to take multilateral approaches in order to succeed. The second lesson is that this high degree of interconnectedness results in multiple vectors for the transfer of sensitive technology, sensitive data. And so that really does require whole of government coordination across countries and across policy areas. The third lesson is that allies need to manage tension between them in order to have a successful effort when it comes to meeting external challenges. So that tension management between allies, I think, is important to success and coordination of efforts. The fourth lesson is that technical assessments need to remain independent of political considerations and be shared among allies in order to build consensus. And just a fifth lesson learned, which is actually much more kind of forward-looking. I think we just heard a very interesting example of an effort to make more concrete these efforts to coordinate in the Inter-Parliamentary Alliance. So going forward, I think building on those efforts is what is going to afford the greatest chance of success. So those lessons and more detail will be coming in written form in the next couple of weeks. So we'll let folks know when that document is out. But now let me transfer the discussion over to our panel. Very thankful to our panelists for joining us. Just by way of introduction here, I will give brief backgrounds on them and turn the conversation over to them. First, we have Hirobumi Kayama, who is Director of Security, Trade Control Policy, and Economic Security at Japanese Ministry of Economy, Trade, and Industry, or METI. He was until recently stationed in the United States as a special advisor to METI. He's now back in Tokyo, so thank you for staying up late. He's in charge of the coordination of export control and foreign investment screening among like-minded nations and policy planning for holistic sensitive technology management for the Japanese government. We'll next hear from Maria Martin Pratt, who is Director in the European Commission Directorate General for Trade, where she's responsible for services in digital trade, investment, intellectual property, and public procurement. And it's in this capacity that she's also the Commission's chief negotiator for their ongoing negotiations with China on a bilateral investment agreement. Before her current post, Ms. Martin Pratt was the head of the copyright unit in the European Commission Communications Networks Content and Technology DG. And then last but not least, we're glad to have Roland Paris, Professor of International Affairs at the University of Ottawa, founder for the Center of International Policy Studies, and an Associate Fellow of Chatham House. He has taken several leaves of absence from his academic career to serve in the government, including as Senior Advisor on Global Affairs and Defense to Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. So you can see we've got a great panel to get into more detail on some of these issues. What I'd like to do, just picking up on Lady Kennedy's comments, I'd like to turn to each of you to give us a sense for how the issue of engagement with China, appreciating the multifaceted, how it looks from your perspective and your capitals. And if I could pose that question to all of you, I'm just going to go in alphabetical order here and ask if Kayama-san could address that question first, and then we'll go to Maria and then Roland.
Well, thank you so much, Stephanie. And then actually, good evening for everybody. Actually, it is 10 p.m. in Tokyo, so probably the audience cannot read my face in my speaking about China. So in this sense, this is my advantage. So answering the question posed by Stephanie, actually, needless to say, Tokyo is a neighboring country of China. So in this sense, Tokyo has been sensitive toward Chinese economic and military ascendance, especially after 2012, when a territorial issue between the two nations over the Southern Islands escalated. And we have experienced various kinds of issues with China, such as rare earth embargo by China, or various political pressure on our private companies. So in this sense, economic security consideration China is not new at all. But recently, China has publicly announced its civil-military fusion strategy. This new move by the Chinese government, gave us a kind of different sense in our policy-making process, because previously our policy-making process was just pursuing the proper balance between the two separate things. One is political and military consideration on China, and the other one is economic consideration on China. However, because of the civil-military fusion strategy, Japanese government has to introduce a geotechnological consideration when we think of our relationship with China, meaning we have to consider both military implications and the economic implications at the same time. So in this sense, the objective and the independent technological assessment of key technologies independent from the political discussions, increases the importance in a policy making process recently. So in this sense, I'm quite curious to or see the upcoming result of the Allied Forum on China. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Kayama-san. Let me go now with that same question to Maria. And I mean, it was interesting. I'm appreciating now in a slightly different way, given all the different time zones here, but the folks represented here on the panel, there's an obvious geographic difference here, but that geographic difference does convey to different considerations when you're looking at the economic linkages, or as Kayama-san just mentioned, specific concern on kind of the military side. So Europe is obviously in a different geographic location from Japan. And as I mentioned in the introduction of you're also involved in the negotiation of a bilateral investment treaty. So how does this issue look kind of from your own individual perspective, but then more broadly, how the relationship with China looks from Brussels? Maria, you're muted, I believe.
I think even if we will be for another year in confinement, we will still be making the same mistake of muting and unmuting. Anyway, let me again say thank you to you. Thank you for CSIS for giving me the opportunity to be in the discussion today, and for the very interesting contribution we had from Baroness Kennedy. Let me react very quickly to one question you made following the intervention by Kayama-san. It is true, geographically, Japan and the European Union are located in quite different places, but I do think a number of the concerns and assessments are not different, and we have a well-established cooperation with Japan on some issues which are being discussed in this discussion today, whether it is on the screening of foreign direct investment, or I hope increasingly on dual-use exports. So that to say, the world is too small to think that just being a little bit more to the west or to this makes a big difference. It does from a military point of view, but that's something that goes a little bit beyond my reach. I'll give you very quickly the view from the European Union side, which I think is interesting because is shifted in particular in the last couple of years. I think the point where it became clear that things were changing was at the time we published a communication in March last year, where we were defining our strategy towards China, and we did acknowledge as the European Union that the balance of opportunities and challenges in our relations with China had been shifting over time. And we use three ways to refer to China, which were all applicable and remain all applicable, which were China is a cooperation partner, is an economic competitor, and is a systemic rival. And I think those three are worth keeping in mind, because in a way they have informed the manner in which our policy vis-a-vis China is evolving. And this appreciation has also been repeated in the latest summit that the European Union had with China. It took place on the 22nd of June via video conference. We didn't have a joint statement at the end of that summit, granted a short video conference one, but in the joint press release that was issued by the Council of Ministers of the European Union and by the European Commission, you find again the same message. It is clearly saying that we need to engage with China is an opportunity and a necessity, but it also says that we have to recognize we do not share the same values and political systems. So this is very, very clearly expressed. And then the second idea, which is the one probably that I can speak more to from my perspective from trade, it clearly says that for our relations to develop further, they must be rules-based and reciprocal in order to achieve a real level playing field. And there again, you see the logic, the continuation, and in practical terms, what does this mean? How do you see those ideas reflected in policymaking in the European Union? I think what you will see and what you already see developing is a combination of, on the one hand, engagement with China, and on the other hand, unilateral measures that are being taken by the European Union. Engagement with China is not only necessary, but as I was saying before, we also consider China to be a partner for cooperation on issues like climate, on issues like the Sustainable Development Goals, on issues like the response to the COVID-19 crisis at the international level. We do think the engagement with China is very important. We think China is part of those that need to work together to find solutions to those problems, which are common problems for all. But then what we are also seeking is a far more, if you want, balanced and reciprocal relationship, in particular from the economic point of view. And that kind of reciprocity and better competition, level playing field, we are seeking in our bilateral engagement with China, like the negotiations of an investment treaty, but also we think very importantly in future discussions in the context of the WTO. The WTO rules book need to be updated. There are important elements there that are missing, in particular as regards subsidies for industrial goods and others. And this is a conversation to have a multilateral level, which we think it is very important also to ensure that China participates in the trade system in a manner that does not distort the competition in the rest of the world. And then the third element that you will see is what I was saying in terms of unilateral measures. What the European Union is doing now is what you often will hear referred to as creating a toolbox, creating the type of tools that unilaterally we can use either to defend the security in Europe vis-a-vis certain investments, and that is the whole putting in place of a system to coordinate the screening of foreign direct investment that is undertaken by the member states in Europe. We are upgrading our regulation that controls the export of certain items, dual use at the moment, and we want to go beyond that. So export control is also a very important element there. And we are looking into how we can ensure that the effects of subsidies, distorting subsidies granted by China can be prevented, in particular when it distorts the level playing field within the internal market. This is a discussion that is very much led at the moment by DG Competition, but that is being reflected in a white paper and a wide consultation that we're undertaking at the moment. So what you can see is, I don't think we can, the relationship between two partners like the European Union and China is too important and too complex to be able to define it on one single line. I think those three approaches that we are undertaking in parallel are going to define how we take things forward. Obviously, the complexity remains there in many fronts, but I hope that gives you an idea as to where we are going at the moment. And by the way, this is fully backed as well by our business community and more largely by civil society.
Thank you, Maria. There was a lot there that I'd like to kind of follow up on, the subsidy issue and kind of the need to take multilateral approaches and reforming some other areas, and how that relates then to achieving the national security objectives, I think is one in particular, but maybe we can come back to that. First, let me then go to Roland and pose that same question to you. You're currently not serving in government, but you've had the benefit of serving in government and seeing that perspective. You now have the benefit of being unencumbered and offering your own thoughts as a private citizen. So would love to hear how things look from Ottawa.
Thank you, Stephanie. And yes, indeed, it is wonderfully liberating to not to be speaking on anyone else's behalf but myself. You know, Canada and China right now, I think everyone on this call knows, are involved in a very serious dispute, and the relationship is extremely tense and has been since late 2018 when Canada arrested the Huawei executive Meng Wanzhou on an extradition request from the US, and then China quickly arrested 2 Canadians, innocent Canadians, and took trade actions against Canada in apparent retaliation and as an effort to try to pressure the Canadian government into releasing or suspending the extradition process for Ms. Meng. Maybe less well known outside of Canada is the effect that these events have had on Canadian public attitudes, which of course is part of the context for Canadian government policy. There's been a remarkable shift in public attitudes in this country towards China. The two countries, you know, Canada and China have had disputes before, but public opinion in this country, views of China remained ambivalent, I would say, for decades, neither strongly positive nor strongly negative. It depended on the nature of the question that was being asked. There was no kind of overall dominant impression. That has changed dramatically in the last year and a half. And I think there are very strong indications that those attitudes are not going to go back to the status quo ante, and that the frame, the understanding of China as a bully has become baked in the Canadian public, and I think increasingly within our political class as well. Now, the Canadian government has continued to be cautious. It's mindful of the risks to these 2 Canadians. It's also wary because of the uncertainty about whether the United States, the Trump administration specifically, will stand with Canada if it's targeted by China for further retaliation. That is a big question mark, and it's part of a larger series of reflections about Canada's relations with the United States and the behavior of the Trump administration and the future of American foreign policy. Nevertheless, the Canadian government's position on China has recently been hardening. Most recently, for example, the extradition agreement with Hong Kong was suspended, and Canada's foreign minister is working on what he calls a new framework for Canadian policy towards China. We'll see what's involved with that. But Canada has yet to make a decision on whether to allow Huawei equipment into its 5G network. Canadian telecoms are, at least 2 major Canadian telecoms have announced that they're not going to include 5G gear, maybe seeing the writing on the wall. Maybe when there's a new framework for Chinese policy announced, it might be done, and that might happen in conjunction with an announcement on the Huawei gear, certainly in light of Britain's decision yesterday. Now, Canada also has a very, very strong interest in working with its traditional democratic partners to push back against China's more aggressive behavior. We see that there is safety in numbers, and we think that, I think it's a prevalent view in Canada that like-minded states will either hang together or they'll hang separately. But there are 2 considerations. One is about U.S. leadership, of course, and this is where not being in government allows me just to be very blunt. If there's any doubt about U.S. commitment to America's traditional partners and allies, don't be surprised if those countries hedge and look out for themselves. Indeed, I think that there's there's concern in this country about becoming a kind of roadkill in a game of geopolitical chicken between the US and China. And, when the United States is introducing sanctions against Canada and other countries on national security grounds on imports of various different metals, or musing about the possibility of deploying US military forces to the Canadian border, or seeking to block the sale of medical masks from an American company to Canada, those have very profound effects on not just public opinion, but also on considerations of of trust. The second, I think, consideration here is that while I think that Canada has a very strong interest in banding together with other like-minded countries to push back against China's more aggressive behavior, there is a risk of a kind of spiraling escalation, and which could have untold consequences for the global economy, ultimately even for regional peace and international peace. So I'd echo what Helena Kennedy said about the talk of a new Cold War not being helpful. So we need resolve and solidarity and restraint. And there are starting points, I think, for cooperation, whether it's through the G7, whether it's through the D10, whether it's through some other mechanisms. But the idea, I think, should be just to start on specific joint strategies, establish joint strategies in areas where we can achieve those. For example, on penalizing any Chinese attempts to dominate strategic technologies through espionage or IP theft, or to devise shared standards on vetting Chinese overseas investment in sensitive sectors, and to prohibit the pressuring of foreign firms operating in China to disclose their trade secrets. I mean, even achieving rudimentary alignment of those policies would be a significant accomplishment, because it would be a basis for doing more. And I do think that that interests are converging. The last year's European Union policy shifts, Britain obviously. I'm seeing shifts in Canada. So I think that the ingredients, the conditions for a coordinated approach are increasingly becoming clear, but it's going to require leadership, enlightened US leadership, and it's going to require resolve, and it's also going to require restraint. Thank you.
Thanks, Roland, for those comments. I am struck by something that Lady Kennedy mentioned, in that there's been a dramatic shift in the UK in response to the national security law and action on Hong Kong. Roland, you just mentioned it, that there was a shift when it came to the arrest of the 2 Canadian citizens. I also noticed that when you mentioned the fact that the imposition of tariffs on national security grounds by the United States, that also was kind of a shock to the system. I was noticing that Maria and Hiro were both nodding their heads as well. So I think this idea, you have kind of this backdrop, but that discrete events can actually kind of propel a pretty rapid change in sentiment is not lost, in particular in the current moment. Hiro, the shock, if you will, that you kind of mentioned that forced a reevaluation is around civil-military fusion. And I want to follow up on that and ask a bit more detailed of a question on the technology side. There has been discussion of something called a technology alliance. This idea that like-minded countries can work more in unison on specific technologies. That maybe as an idea sounds great, but then in practice, one wonders if that's actually achievable, because among allies, there can still be economic competition. And so how realistic do you think is that idea of a technology alliance that countries can work together on specific technologies?
Well, actually, I do believe that, democracies can achieve the effective alliance of the proper technology strategy against techno-authoritarian government if we can see a sensible leadership, which is supported by the domestic political, voices, and which is also supported by the scientific and objective thoughts in looking at the technological technological issues. But recent actions taken by the United States, has made me quite a concern about my confidence in the successful realization of the alliance among democracies, because the recent action, especially the export control measures against Huawei, of course, Japanese government can share the concerns behind these actual actions taken by the United States. However, we are not able to agree with the actual actions taken by the United States because there is no coordination before deciding, concrete actions by the United States with the like-minded nations. And then secondly, the US unilateral export control measures can have an extraterritorial effect, meaning US export control measures can have a great influence toward global supply chain quite effectively. And then this influence can be done only by the US decision. So in this sense, yes, recent action against Huawei is quite limited in terms of the scope, and then actual cases which will be affected by these measures. However, this could be a starting point of the US, unilateral actions without any coordination with us. So in this sense, I do believe that the other democracies should propose some potential area of the coordinated actions among democracies by showing the scientific and objective assessment of the threat of the military applicability of the specific area of technologies. And then we should start the scientific discussion, which can be supported even by the discussion at the WTO. I mean, we have to identify the proper technological choke point, which has clear implications of the military applicability threat by authoritarian government. So this is still my personal idea, but I do believe that we should start this sort of discussion from the semiconductor-related technologies, because semiconductor are going to be the basis for various kinds of new technologies like AI or quantum computing or any kinds of autonomous vehicle technologies. And then in terms of the semiconductor technology, semiconductor manufacturing technologies, still democracies has some sort of oligopolistic situation or oligopolistic or position in providing these manufacturing technologies to the other nations. So in this sense, still I, by myself, believing in the effectiveness of the concerted unilateral actions by like-minded nations.
Thank you, Hiro. I'm monitoring some of the Q&As here as they come in, and a number of them get at the challenge of, as Maria mentioned, how do you manage a relationship that is one of economic partner, economic competitor, and strategic rival and the challenges of getting at that. So any kind of thoughts on how that can be managed? And a more specific point, Maria, that picks up on what you mentioned before on tackling some of the challenges to the trading system, and that relates to industrial and innovation policy, which can be geared at some of the strategic technologies that Hiro and others have mentioned. But how does industrial policy or innovation policy fit within these discussions of economic competition, at least from the EU's perspective?
Mm. Okay. On your first question, I do absolutely recognize the inherent complexity of trying to have a relationship with a major economy where you do, on the one hand, have to find the ways to cooperate from an economic point of view, but you also are mindful of the differences created by the political regime and by an state-led economy. But we are not back, as it was being said at the beginning of the discussions today, to a Cold War situation. We do have, and I think it's the interest of everybody in the world, to find the ways to engage where we can engage and defend our systems where we need to. And for that, I wanted to rebound on what has been said before. In all these discussions where we talk about China and when we talk about China and the US, very often what you hear, and I fully agree to this, is that the US to a large extent has been right in the identification of the problems, but wrong in the identification of the means to address the problems. And I think now, after a number of years down the path that the Trump administration has taken, is very clear that there are severe limitations to a unilateral approach to try to address China's most challenging trading practices, but also practices that may them have consequences beyond our economic relation and impinge in our security. So there, while understanding the complexity of coordinating in these areas, member states, the role that can be played, countries around the world, not member states, the role that can be played by the G7 or the G20 has its values and limitations, and the WTO is a fora, but for some very specific types of discussions. But we do have to find a way, probably in a pragmatic way, in a targeted one, but we do have to go from a unilateral strategy towards a strategy that brings in different countries in the world, and we need there, as I think Roland was saying, an enlightened leadership from the US. The point you make about industrial policy means many things for different people, and I always approach the term with some caution, because it can mean basically let's try to see how we can foster our industrial base, our knowledge, our technology for purposes such as a transition towards a greener economy, towards digital transformation. How can we empower our SMEs? That is the right discussion about an industrial policy. Sometimes, in some places, behind the terms industrial policy, you might find ideas that are far more about closing our borders, going towards self-sufficiency, or even fighting problems we may have today precisely with the same tools that we have been complaining about for decades, like distortive subsidies. So in a way, whenever you hear a politician talking about an industrial policy, one needs to hear carefully as to what is behind that discussion. In Europe, we have, in the European Union, we have started with this commission a very healthy discussion, because I think really what we are trying to do is targeting, as I said, the greening of our economy, the digitalization, the support of our SMEs, the using the value and the strength of our internal market, for instance, for standard setting at international level. But again, we need to be careful that the debate doesn't go beyond that and morphs into more of a protectionist stance that can happen in many places.
Thanks, Maria. We're close to time here, but I do want to follow up with one final question here that picks up with some of the questions that have been submitted, and also relates to what Lady Kennedy had mentioned, and that is a concern that we are not heading toward a new Cold War. One of the questions that came in actually referenced, a more kind of kinetic confrontation. What are the chances of kind of moving in that direction? And then a final question that asked about what is meant by enlightened leadership, what specifically is needed. And let me go with that question to Roland, an easy question for you to end this panel. But we've been talking about China, but we've been referencing a lot the United States. Canada obviously has a very close relationship with the United States and vice versa. But what can you say about what Canada might be looking for from the United States? And in that answer, maybe you can address this question of what's meant by enlightened leadership.
Sure, I can try. Of course, Canada shares many of the concerns and aspirations of other liberal democracies in Europe, Japan, and elsewhere. It's also in a particular and unusual situation of being especially reliant on access to the US economy. 75% of our merchandise exports go to the US, and that accounts for about 20% of our gross domestic product, which is pretty remarkable. Although I should say that Americans sometimes forget that it does run the other way too, that Canada is the top export destination for 35 US states. But I think that, more than anything, that Canada benefits from, has always sought to sustain a rules-based trading system. And I think that enlightened American leadership is recognizing that a rules-based system, which involves some self-constraint, is actually in America's interest as well, as opposed to something that is fundamentally harmful to America's interests. As similarly, having a set of long-standing, reliable allies based on friendships that go back are force multipliers for the United States, but that also involves recognizing that allies and partners might not see situations exactly the same way, and that there's a need to compromise in devising policies that can bring everyone along. So I think that's the essence to me of enlightened leadership for a global power. And I think the United States has been weakening its global influence and power in the last few years because it has not been applying those principles. But, I think that even an even playing field does also include expecting China to behave differently, that a rules-based system needs to be applied to China in order to establish a more even playing field in the trade arena, to deal with problems like, as Maria said, Chinese state-owned enterprises that benefit from sweetheart deals from the CCP that are trade diverting. An even playing field means pushing back against China's own protectionism and its use of trade policy as a political weapon. But I think it also means rejecting protectionism from other countries where that protectionism is being dressed up in high principle or in fancy strategic language, but it's really just plain old protectionism. And so the spectacle, to me, of Donald Trump and Joe Biden, each competitively trying to claim ownership of the Buy America moniker, that's not very encouraging. You know, and it is just part of the difficulty in response to the question, one of the questions in the Q&A, of establishing this kind of a cooperation among like-mindeds at a heated political and economic moment. But I think that coordination is possible. I'm a firm believer that countries eventually revert to the mean of their own core interests. And I think that all the countries that we're talking about in whatever institutional forum, whether it's G7 or D10 or whatever it might be, that these countries do have a clear interest in coordinating more closely with regard to pushing back against some of China's aggressive behavior while exercising restraint. So we'll see what happens over the next few months.
Well, with that very enlightened answer, I will just thank the panelists here. We had a great kickoff keynote with Baroness Kennedy, but then to follow it up with this panel, appreciate your depth of knowledge, your candor in your comments today, and look forward to continuing to work with all of you. Just to mention, again, we'll be coming out with our lessons learned paper on allied economic cooperation in the next week or two, so please stay tuned for that. And just want to thank all of you again, in particular Kayama-san, for staying up late with us. We'll look forward to continuing this discussion in the months to come. So thank you all.